everything.
Yep.
No, they were saying that we shouldn't say climate change, we call it climate crisis.
Okay.
We shouldn't call it biodiversity, we call it wildlife.
Okay.
So we don't call it...
Did you send me a Facebook thing the other day? No. Right, well, today I'm going to, or I was intending to talk primarily about China, because I think it's become quite a big issue. I think it's beginning to stoke up, and I've often spoken about China in the past, but I tended to speak generically rather than specifically and just touch on the issue as it arose. And it occurs to me that I've not actually spoken on the subject for quite a while, and it is my specialist subject. So because of that, and I noticed over here actually, last week there was a discussion on China that was quite sophisticated level of discussion, and I thought, so it's not that tedious for people. It might be a bit, but I can cover the subject, and it's my speciality. So that's what I thought I'd do. So I'll let you start first of all, if you want to ask something about that subject matter. My general orientation is when I was a young man, 30 years ago, I was involved in a Marxist political group, and we believed that the regimes that existed in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, etc., were what we call Stalinist regimes, and that the preferred alternative was for a democratic type of socialism to take over the administration in these societies through revolutionary change. By that we went political revolution rather than social counter-revolution. So as a result of that, myself being involved in this Marxist political trend, I was living in Berlin at the time, or 30 years ago now. Then about this time, I went to China at the time of Tiananmen Square. I discussed with people on Tiananmen Square and observed what happened. I left China after the movement was defeated, and then I went back to Berlin and went to East Germany. I lived in East Germany just before the Berlin Wall fell down, and participated in events in East Germany. So it's kind of, as the 30th anniversary, I'm using it as a hook to relate both my own understanding of these things and also my own experience of these things, and also my political understanding that has followed from that over the last 30 years. And the spark for me talking specifically about this question today is that I watched a long discussion that took place in the United States about a few weeks ago. And the discussion was within the Trump circle, the advisors to Trump, but not only to Trump, also significant layer amongst the Democrats. They have taken the view now that the trade war between China and America, or between America and China better said, is effectively a precursor or symbolic for an all-out assault on the system that exists in China, with the intention of overthrowing the government of China and establishing a regime which is amenable and pliant in the world order to the dominance of American power. And so, whereas the Chinese say they want a multipolar world in which China is able to rise up, China, don't forget, has 5 times as many people, 4 times to 5 times as many people as America, and yet a GDP about 60% of America based on dollar terms. Slightly more than America on what's called purchasing power parity. But purchasing power parity is a basket of goods, not goods in the real world market, not the real exchange prices dominated by dollars. So basically it's people like Steve Bannon, who was the campaign manager for Donald Trump's election campaign, who are promoting this agenda that China operates a socio-economic system and political system that is completely and absolutely counterposed to the Western American-dominated system and must be overthrown. Basically, it's the shootout of the OK Corral as far as they're concerned. The battle with China defines the future of America and therefore the future of capitalism in the world. That's their perspective, that's their angle. Any questions or contributions? The focus is... Sorry?
Is the reverse true that the Chinese angle is the same in reverse?
No. Actually, to be honest with you, I think it should be. But it's not the position of the Chinese government. Neither of their theory... Well, obviously it's my opinion, but I think it's a quite well-informed opinion. I study the Chinese... I write for a Chinese government website. I study the Chinese news. I study the Chinese theoretical journals, Qiushi, for example, the Central Committee official journal. I study the speeches and writings of the leadership in China. I study military documents from the Chinese government. And so I've tried to follow what's happening within the Chinese government and within Chinese political and economic theory.
So if it's not a mirror of the Americans' position, what is their position? What is their 10-year plan?
That's a good question. A good question. To understand where the Chinese ideological viewpoint is derived from, I think you have to understand where the Chinese political system established its framework of operating. And that really was under Joseph Stalin's Russia. Stalin and his followers, and the continuation of Stalin, in other words, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Chernenko, and so on, these people argued that it is possible to establish some form of socialism, what they used to call real existing socialism, a practical alternative to capitalism, which would both act as a developmental state, able to advance the productive forces, the wealth in society, raise living standards, improve conditions, and compete in a peaceful manner with the West. And that meant technological, scientific, economic, and cultural competition. The economic was the key, and the scientific was the key. So a key marking point in understanding the dynamics of Soviet competition with America and with the Western world was the space program. In 1961, the Soviets sent a man into space. And then a second man circled the world 10 times in a spaceship. His name was German Titov. And this was just before the Berlin Wall was built. The Berlin Wall was built in order to seal up one section of the world, to isolate it and segregate it from the world in order to develop in competition with capitalism. Now, the Marxist view, in my opinion, takes class struggle as the starting point. So the view of Trotsky, who was the opponent of Stalin in the 1920s and early 30s, was that revolutionary change had to infect the most advanced capitalist countries. You couldn't use... Sorry?
Oh means I agree with you.
Well, that's what Trotsky argued. And that therefore the revolution was a global process which would have to affect advanced countries, backward countries economically, and also raise the profile of the type of regime that you would like to see in existence. Not establish something based on the exigencies of the momentary power relations in the world. In other words, establish a dictatorial control and hold that dictatorial control in the name of socialism. Instead of this, everything should be done to maintain a regime that has better political rights, social rights, cultural rights than the Western capitalist countries. And because of that, there was a disparity between what the Stalinists wanted in the Soviet Union and what the Marxist thinkers wanted in the world, the people who tried to adhere to the basic framework that Marx had worked out in the early years of the Russian Revolution. How does that relate to China? The Chinese did this, which was correct, vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. They after 1979, they allowed private enterprise to operate inside China. That had a tremendously positive effect on the economic development of China. And contrary to what most leftists and Marxists in the world believed, it was a positive contribution to Marxist economic theory as well. And it went into line with the theoretician that I based my PhD on, is a guy called Preobrazhensky. Preobrazhensky said in the 1920s, during the debate on Soviet industrialization, when there was still open and democratic and free thought expressed in the newspapers, in journals, on the radio, in the universities, you could freely express your opinion in the 1920s up until 1928 in the Soviet Union. So from 17 to 20, 11 years, there was freedom of thought in Russia. Not always complete political freedom, but freedom of thought was allowed. And there were two views about Soviet development. One view, from 1921 until 1928, was the view of one of the Central Committee members. He was called Nikolai Bukharin. And Bukharin had the dominant view, the majority view, inside the party. And his view was, allow the capitalists to develop. Allow private property to develop without any real limitations, because that will lay the economic basis for a development of the economy, and gradually you can create the economic foundation for socialism and slowly take action to move towards a collectivist economy, raising funds from the private sector. The problem was, and this was the argument, the counter-argument put, and as I say, I think this is relevant today for China. Bukharin and his faction, which included Stalin, they argued that rather than allow, or better said, they argued that rather than take on the capitalists, rather than increase the size of the collective economy, you should allow what they called, they used to say the word, get rich is glorious. To enrich yourselves is a good thing because it lays the material foundation for socialism, because Russia was backward. They had starvation in 1921. They had cannibalism in 1921. Out of starvation. They had cannibalism in the early 1930s. So you've got to understand the context in which this revolution took place. It came out of the First World War. The people were starving. That's why they made revolution. They continued being, up until 1926, the economy was poorer than 1913, before the First World War began. Only in 1926-27 did they reach the level of production of 1913. So there you have to understand what the desperate economic condition was in Russia at that time.
Can I ask you a question? Why is it that so Marx would have expected the revolutions to be successful in the developed capitalist countries like France, Italy, Germany, Britain, right? There's four main ones. Why is it then, I'm interested to know, why is it that in the interwar period, it was Spain and Russia, the very backward economies at the time? Why was it that they were the ones who really had successful revolutions and not the other ones?
During Marx's time in London, from 1849 till 1883, he studied the system of capitalism in the most advanced capitalist country, thinking that the development of capitalism in Britain and in Germany and in France would lead to revolution. First in France, then in Germany, then in England. And that these countries, as the pioneers of capitalism and the most advanced industrial economies, would lay the basis for a revolution which would spread to the rest of the world. And the economic development of the rest of the world would take place through a combination of the development of capitalism in other countries, and the establishment of socialism in the most advanced countries, which could then economically outstrip any competitor countries. The consequence of that would be, in the theory that Marx had proposed, was that a collectivist Britain, a collectivist France, and a collectivist Germany would provide the technology and resources based on collectivist principles to those countries around the world which were less developed. So therefore, he said, the time of the 1860s, Marx said, well, in China it's possible, he said, that foreign armies will come to China, and China, they will be confronted by a revolution in which the flag, liberty, equality, fraternity, is waved over China. In other words, the flag of the French Revolution, the capitalist revolution of 1789. So in other words, Marx did have a vision that revolution could take place in more backward countries, but these revolutions would initially have a capitalist character. This was the dominant view within the world Marxist movement up until the First World War. There were two main dissenting voices. These were Leon Trotsky and a Menshevik by the name, that means a majority faction of the Russian Labour Party, by the name of Pavlos. And they put forward a theory based on one of Marx's writings around 1848, that a revolution that establishes capitalism in a backward country in which imperialism, the dominance of the key capitalist countries over the world, in which imperialism controls the world, would mean that the workers could be the leading political force within society and the leading class within society, because indigenous capitalism in Nigeria, South Africa, China, Russia had a certain strength, but it wasn't very strong. It wasn't able to rule society. But the working class was employed by indigenous capitalism and by foreign capitalism. So the workers in the foreign capitalist companies and the workers in the indigenous companies would be a larger political and social force than the indigenous capitalists themselves. Therefore, Trotsky argued, that the revolution inevitably would begin as a capitalist revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. The workers and the bosses would take to the streets against the autocracy, against tribalism, against the church, against the monarchy. But when they did so, and against foreign intervention, but when they did so, the workers would have demands that go beyond what the capitalists want.
So they want two revolutions in one go.
So two revolutions would be merged into one. This was the theory put forward by Trotsky and later adopted by Lenin in 1917. That went well in this respect. They were perfectly correct that the way in which the world had developed was that imperial countries, the first capitalist countries, gained dominance over the entire planet and prevented the indigenous development of the rest of the planet along the same lines as England, France, Germany, and so on. So the initial capitalist countries would not be replicated in the other countries of what they called the imperialist colonial world. Only a few countries, and this is proven even up until today, only 13 countries have developed since 1945 from poor countries to developed countries. Only 13. South Korea, Taiwan, a lot of them are small. Taiwan, Singapore, countries like that. Botswana, actually, I think. Not many countries have developed to this level. 13 countries have developed into the wealthy countries. The rest of them remained either backward or reached the middle income, then been held backwards. They call it, there's a term for it, they call it the middle income trap, but I don't think it's an accurate term, but it's a commonly used term in economics. Now, yes?
Getting back to the possible war between America and China, what do you see the significance of the rollout of 5G all over the industrial world?
5G has become a battleground in the war between China and America. The Americans, as you know, have been saying that Huawei, which is a Chinese company, officially private, but certainly with links to the People's Liberation Army, that Huawei will use 5G. 5G, basically, you've got 4G on your phone in all likelihood, and in all likelihood it doesn't work very well. Certainly if you've got the mobile phone provider that I've got. And before that you had 3G. So it's spectrums of the radio magnetic waves that allow you to access telephones.
It's a vast increase
Now,
in spectrum.
sorry?
It's microwave radiation,
Yeah.
weapons-grade technology.
Yes. Now, 5G basically is a mechanism for transmitting data far more rapidly, about 100 times faster than you have with 4G. And the main company controlling the rollout of the technology is a Chinese company, Huawei. The others are Ericsson, and what's the other one? There's another Finnish one, a Finnish or Swedish one. In any case, it's the Chinese dominate the technology. And the idea is if you want to have a car that runs without a person in it, or a taxi without people driving it, autonomous vehicles, if you want to carry out surgery across the world, so a surgeon can carry out brain surgery using a robotic arm in London or elsewhere in the field in Africa, then you would need to have high-speed, permanent connection with no latency to be able to operate those machineries without them crashing into people or without committing errors due to latency in time. Right? So it has to be effectively, nearly as possible, real-time transmission of data. Now, in order to do that, you have to have these chips that transmit the data available everywhere. That means you maybe put a chip inside the fence here, or in the tree, or in a lamppost, because otherwise you'll not have the proximity to be able to make sure the speed is up to date. So basically, because the Americans, this is the nature of capitalism. Capitalism operates based on private companies deciding when and where to invest based on profitability. The higher the profits, the more money goes into it. The lower the profit, the money withdraws. The lower the profit, if there's a generalized decrease in profit rates, generalized across an economy, you get a retraction of investment. The capitalist folds their arms. He says, what's the point if he's investing in fences and making 10% a year? If the profit rate goes down to 3%, he can say to himself, well, I won't bother investing. I'll invest my money in paintings, or I'll invest my money in property, because I know there's a shortage of property in London. I can make profits by doing that instead of producing new things. So capitalist cycles of economy are based on the amount of capital they invest, determined by profitability. If profits are high, investment goes in. Profits are low, investment draws out. Now, there is a relationship between this and between competition. The more that capitalist companies compete against each other, the more difficult it is to extract a profit. Case in point, if you've got a mobile phone like my iPhone here, I was given this because it's morally redundant. It's morally redundant because for my two sons, this is no longer acceptable. And so for them, my old phone broke, so they said, I'll have that one. Because it's no longer the latest, it no longer does the things they want to do, it's morally redundant. The problem lies in this, is that the investment in research and development and on the machinery and equipment and resources to produce this mobile phone goes into production of a mobile phone, probably under the auspices of a company called Foxconn, also known as Honhai, and they will produce the phones. They won't only produce the iPhone, they'll also produce the Samsung or the Huawei or the Sony or the Google phone and so on. They have inside their factories the capacity to produce any type of mobile phone in the world. The problem is that one mobile phone must compete against another mobile phone. So iPhone bring out the iPhone 10, Huawei bring out the Huawei 10.1, and it comes out a couple of months after iPhone. That means a competition takes place as to who controls the maximum profits for the short period of time in which they have a competitive advantage. Once that competitive advantage is overthrown, then the profit rate declines for all the companies. Then they need something new. So the something new is the next level of phone. Or, combined with that, the next level of communication speed. So when they move to 5G, all your mobile phones are redundant. They have to buy a new phone with 5G capacity within it. And all the memory storage capacity, memory processing capacity, RAM, random access memory that you need. And therefore you will require new investments, new technologies, and new marketplaces for the new products. Now, because China controls the process, both of the production of mobile phones and all the assembly really, and also the infrastructure development for 5G, the Americans have decided that this is effectively that Sputnik moment. Just like the Soviets sent in 1957, wasn't it? 57, sent Sputnik into space for communications technology. And thereby, by controlling space, it was he who controls space, controls Earth. Because they didn't send rockets into space or a man on the moon in order to conquer the moon. They sent a man into space in order to send rockets to Earth. That was the purpose of the technology of space travel. Now, we have a similar moment in the Earth in relation to 5G. As far as the Americans are concerned, 5G represents a Chinese threat to the dominance of American technology companies, which are based in Silicon Valley, an area within California that dominates the American economy. The economy of California is like 5-6 times bigger than any other part of the United States of America. In and of itself, I don't remember the statistics now, but in and of itself, it would probably still be, one of the top 3 or 4 economies in the world. Silicon Valley is the central core of the technology companies that dominate the internet and modern technology in the world today. But of course, one of the aspects of that is that the American internet dominance allowed them to dominate the information flows around the world. That meant that when Ed Snowden found out about what they were doing with the NSA, you may remember, if you haven't seen the film Ed Snowden, watch it, or called Snowden, watch it, because it's a relatively accurate representation of what the battleground was between the National Security Agency, the CIA, the American government, and the world's population. Ed Snowden, don't forget, something like, I don't know how many years ago it was now, 7-8 years ago it was, he exposed that the NSA was recording everything in the world. And they were monitoring. He had the capacity, Ed Snowden, as a contractor to the NSA, a permanent intelligence agency operation to monitor and survey the world in order to identify dangers to American power. And this agency, a contractor within Ed Snowden, had the capacity to monitor, without his knowledge, to monitor the phone conversations and electronic communication of the President of America. So in other words, the agency dominated the information spectrum available in the world. Now, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, and all the main companies associated with these technologies made agreements with the American state to survey and monitor the entire world, all your electronic communications. They also made an agreement with the British and with their allies, what's called so-called Five Eyes, New Zealand, Australia, Britain, Canada, and America, who have a collaborative intelligence agency infrastructure. The British sent a submarine under the Atlantic Ocean. And what they did was they tapped in to from the submarine to the cables that carry the data between America and Europe, which is the majority of the world's data transmits through these pipelines. And so by going into extraterritorial waters, the British GCHQ tapped into all the communication in the world. In order, the intention has always been to make what they call complete spectrum dominance. Space and Earth communications will be totally controlled by the intelligence agencies to facilitate the maintenance of the national power of the ruling power, which in this case is America. And they know that Europe, or the European leaders, or the United Nations leaders, or the European government leaders, they were all monitored, observed, and recorded by the NSA. So we know this. This is not some invention. The documentary evidence has been presented. That's why Ed Snowden is a refugee in Russia. That's fact. It's not my invention. Now, the danger came in this, is that the private companies like Facebook and Google, they have their own information domains they fight over. Facebook has 1.5 billion users. Most of you will be users of Facebook. And so what they tried to do was to monetize the information they get access to and to enhance the power of that information for the accumulation of wealth and power by the owners of Facebook. And therefore last year, when in New Oxford Street, Cambridge Analytica were exposed, again by a whistleblower inside, Wiley his name was, a whistleblower working inside Cambridge Analytica, exposed that, for example, 2 key electoral events in recent history, the Brexit vote and Donald Trump's election, both of them were claimed, both by Bannon, who was in the case of America, and by Cambridge Analytica, as victories for their information service. Cambridge Analytica manipulated the advertising and the promotion to serve their interests and swing the vote 1-2%. Enough to justify the idea that they would be able to alter, particularly using what they call artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence basically means this. Once upon a time when I was a kid, we used to play computer chess, and you could, even at the highest level, someone like Addy here would be able to defeat the computer chess. Nowadays, I think it was called Deep Blue by IBM, all chess experts in the world are defeated by computers. And the more sophisticated game, called Go, which is a strategy game from ancient China and Japan, that much more sophisticated game, recently a computer defeated the best people at that. So the theory is that if you apply artificial intelligence, it will exponentially increase and learn itself. And therefore, at a certain point, it will make decisions. For example, a friend of mine is involved in corporate advising in the City of London. So he works as an advisor for investment banks, all these sort of things. And when these investment banks have meetings, board meetings, to make economic decisions, you'll have 2 or 3 members of the board and a computer. And the computer is allowed a vote at the meeting. This is now, not future, this is now. The computer has, for example, in those meetings, in a meeting of 4, the computer will have 25% of the vote. So the idea being that the computer would be able to calculate, based on historical models and on its own learning ability, will be able to calculate probabilities and take actions superior to that of a human being. And so therefore, the idea is that he who masters the technologies will be able to master the world and gain an unassailable advantage through artificial intelligence in certain key domains, which will maintain the power and position of the winning party almost indefinitely, or certainly for the foreseeable future. Because an artificial intelligence computer linked to modern technology of the National Security Agency, for example, would in theory be able to identify people who need to be smeared, attacked, brought down, killed, and so on, in advance of the actual danger presenting itself. That's the theory. Now, they're very hot on this theory. Just the same as the American Army adopted laser-guided missiles again driven by computer technology and real-time communication infrastructure. Just the same as they adopted these technologies in order to fight warfare in a way that minimizes the losses to the American soldiery itself and becomes a battleground of technology. Air wars, bombing the enemy, firing at strategic targets, targeting individual enemies like Jihadi John, for example. It started in 1994 with Dudayev in Russia. Yeltsin was sitting in a meeting. They came into him and they said, "We know where Dudayev is. We can locate him within 20 meters. So they sent a cruise missile that blows up within 100 meters and killed him. And since that time, it's been the general mode of warfare of the United States of America and the leading technological military powers to use this technology as the mechanism to reduce the danger of a Vietnam-type scenario, where you lose tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of your own soldiers in a combat situation on the ground. And so it was always no ground war. This was the policy. So if you extrapolate from that and multiply the technologies of the last 20 years into the next 20 years, you get an idea about the scenarios of warfare that the American state is conceptualizing as the mechanism of fighting China. Robot wars, space wars, high-speed communication warfare, and economic warfare. The economic warfare is what Donald Trump is doing with the tariffs. He says 25% tariffs against the Chinese. Knowing, and he's correct in this, the Chinese are in a weaker position in relation to this. Contrary to what is made out, most Chinese products are not produced from beginning to end. They're produced at a level that basically brings the machinery together. Now, just one point before both of you come in. That is the following. An interesting example of the collectivist capacity of human beings in relation to modern technology is in Shenzhen. Shenzhen is often described as the most capitalist city in the world, whereas actually it's not. What they have, however, is there's one like great big industrial complex in Shenzhen where you can go, anyone can go, and you can buy any components for a mobile phone. Not only for a mobile phone, but any components that are available in China, you can buy them for modern technology. So you can make a robot, you can make an autonomous vehicle, you can design a mobile phone that emphasizes 3D gaming. You can design your own mobile phone, this is. You can design an iPhone that specializes in the quality of sound through the music. You can just adjust and amend, because all the components that are needed to put together these phones are available in the marketplace on the street. Now, because of that, the capacity for collectivist combination of technologies to produce what you want rather than what they want you to have is there. That's revealed by the technological activities happening now in Shenzhen. That's where the main innovation is going. And that's why Silicon Valley is also losing out to the Chinese, because the capacity for innovation in such a scenario is far greater. Apple, Google, Samsung, they forbid you to do this. You're not allowed to open your phone and put different pieces of equipment in it. That's forbidden in the copyright contract you sign when you purchase the product. And every time you use the software, you're asked, sign this. It guarantees in there that you're not allowed to combine whatever you like, because they own it as the proper intellectual property, and they want to get 60 years of technology. Of course, they know in 2 years it's out of date, but it stops you going backwards and reassembling older technologies to serve the purposes you want. Capitalism, although it moves forward very fast, is holding back development that moves forward much faster. Oh, that's the whole point about capitalism. The gentleman and then you. Go on.
Okay. In terms of technological warfare, the rollout of 5G is warfare against the public, because it's a military design operation.
Yeah, I think people mistake, although there are arguments about this, that it's military design. This is military designed. This is not some toy. It is designed by the military, by state funding through the military.
It's not microwave radiation.
Well, it is microwave
Well,
radiation.
it's not microwave radiation.
It's not the intensity,
No,
but it is
exactly,
microwave
but
radiation.
The intensity that's coming out in 5G.
Whether 5G is dangerous for the human brain, I don't know. People are saying it is. I haven't seen the evidence for it. But if that evidence is there, there's an argument to control the technology as it affects your... But people said this about mobile phone, don't forget. They said the mobile phone causes cancer to the brain. Now, there were some cases where this was true, and it really is about the amount of utilization that you put into it. But the key thing to understand there is, go back to the point, everything from satellite communication to the processing chip to the internet itself, all of the elements that go to make up this mobile phone were invented and developed by the military. They are instruments of war. That's what it is. There is an economic war between different socio-economic systems. The Chinese system is based on the dominance of public ownership. Associated with that dominance of public ownership, there is a bureaucracy of power that exercises control over the publicly owned entities. And as a political level, that's called the Communist Party of China. In America, the leading figures in technology, Google, Facebook, Samsung, and so on, these companies are private companies. Their decisions are based on profitability. They have some correspondence with the military, with the government, if the government gives them contracts, etc. But in China, the public sector is the government. The word in Chinese for Communist Party is 共产党. 共产党. It means public property party. That's what it is. That's the only purpose for existence of the Chinese Communist Party, to defend public property. They don't always do that, but that's the purpose of its existence. That's the reason why it maintains power, because it claims the authority of looking after the interests of the public. Whether it does so or not is an open question, but that's the authority it rests upon. And the capitalism, Donald Trump's authority, and his personal position as well, is based upon this claim to be the representative of private property. Because in the Western and in American ideology, private property and the individual right to property is the precondition, the philosophical underpinning of the entire socio-economic system. So that is when they have public property, like the army, the navy, the military, the security services, education service, research entities. These entities are there to be designed to assist the development of private property. So public property serves private property. In China, it's supposed to be the other way around.
Can I ask you a question? John, I think it was last year, the Financial Times said that, or was it maybe 2 years ago, that an American ship almost collided with a Chinese destroyer ship. And then you have John Pilger, who's quite well regarded. He's probably the best political journalist in the world right now, I'd say. He says that there's a coming war with China as well. And I just wanted to ask you, because I've spoken about this to some people and they say it's a bunch of rubbish. We're more likely to attack Iran than we are to attack China. I said to some people, is there a coming war with China? And they said it's much more likely that America's going to attack Iran. I wanted to ask you, do you think that there's a coming war with China? Do you think this technological conflict might evolve into that? Like a real war,
rather than China.
Not just a technological, economic war like you've been describing very well. I'm talking about a hot, physical, violent conflict.
Well, there is a governmental sponsored organisation. It's called The Present Danger. And if you look up on YouTube, The Present Danger, and look up on Wikipedia, The Present Danger, there was Present Danger Soviet Union. Now recently there's been Present Danger China. They call it that. The Present Danger China. And bigwigs like Steve Bannon, Trump's main advisor before or during his election, the sinologist Gordon Chang published a book 2001, The Coming Collapse of China. So these are Newt Gingrich, is involved with it, Speaker of the House. These people regard the global conflict as a conflict between America and China. That's the primary conflict. Like in the past, the primary conflict was America-Soviet Union. That doesn't mean there aren't conflicts that break out on the edges of that, like the Vietnam War, like the bombing of Laos, like the war in Korea, that appear to have their independent life. Syria as well.
Ukraine.
Conflict with Russia. But they were talking, when I saw this video of them all arguing their case, it seemed to me that the central focus, they said the following, for example. Who was it? I think it was Bannon said this. He said, Russia we're in conflict with Russia, he said, but in China is our enemy. So Russia is a potential ally. China is the root and branch enemy.
Then why are they surrounding Russia and China and pointing all these missiles at both those countries? Both of them are being encircled. And like you said, full spectrum dominance. It's the air, the sky, the space, Britain, everywhere, every country is a battlefield.
I mean, there's a valid question to be posed. You see, in the past, when you asked this earlier about China, in the past, China attempted to do what Deng Xiaoping said. He said, rise slowly, do not rock the boat. That was his opinion he gave to the whole Politburo and the Central Committee. Rise slowly, surreptitiously, do not rock the boat. This was Stalin's theory. Peaceful coexistence. Or as Khrushchev used to say, we will bury you, but we will bury you through our technological superiority and our economic superiority. In 1961, the Soviet Communist Party said they will overtake the West by 1980, not only in military capacity, but in the total productivity, individual productivity of the workers. So living standards would overtake America. There would be a 30-hour working week, highest living standard, highest culture, shortest working week. The people in the West would want to live like the Russians. That was the hope. In China, the program is as follows. Poverty to be eradicated by 2021, 2 years' time. China to reach a moderate advanced living standard by 2049. That's the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Revolution. However, this theory relies upon a relatively peaceful environment with the West. And the Americans have concluded they cannot allow this to happen. It is an existential threat to the United States of America and thereby to the whole capitalist system. And so they've decided to pivot. I mean, it happened it's a bipartisan thing. It happened under Obama, and it's happening under Trump. There's slightly different emphasis, but the fundamental orientation is the same.
Is it not mutual, this America-China? Surely it's
No,
mutual.
because Jen Xiaoping said, I don't know if you can trust him, but he said he wants to move beyond great power politics. He did say that. He wants to change the way states relate to each other so that they're not trying to always be one up and better than each other.
It's quite important to understand the historical context. Some people talk now about civilizations being at war. So, for example, they say India as new civilization state. China, 5,000 years civilization. So now Donald Trump and his brigade are saying the Americans represent liberal, democratic, capitalist civilization based on private property and individual drive. So this is the theory, that civilizations are clashing. And these civilizations, one is the West, another is China. Russia's also attempting to create a civilization state. So they're calling it now. So it's like Samuelson, the war of civilizations. So the Chinese Communist Party is racked by internal contradictions. There are many, this is proven not by me, but by Xi Jinping himself. Because Xi Jinping, when he came to power in 2013, he launched the biggest anti-corruption campaign since under Mao Zedong. Over 1 million members out of 89 million members of the Communist Party have been charged with some form of corruption offence. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. Even at the very top, I think out of the Politburo, 3 members of the Politburo taken down for large-scale, multi-million-pound corruption activities. So there is this existential problem inside China for the Communist Party. And that is that if it's regarded as a corrupt entity, thieving from the people, which is how it is widely regarded, then the government will fall, the party will fall, there'll be civil war, and capitalism will conquer. This is, you could have some form of democratic government, but you could also have a civil war like during the interwar years, from 1911, after the, after the anti-monarchical rebellion. Up until 1949, there was some form of civil war and it divided China. Warlords controlling one area. Because China can be divided up, just like Russia or the Soviet Union. Each area, there can be a fiefdom. And in many parts of China, they all talk about China being a unified state. Well, it's not really a unified state. Yes, it could. Firstly, there are many different nationalities within China. That's why the repression of the Uyghurs. Because they fear that on the borders with Russia and the borders to the Middle East, Muslim groupings could gain control. In Tibet, which used to be a British protectorate, they're worried about that with India. In Yunnan province, which is dominated by minorities, like the tribal people of Burma, the tribal people of Laos. It's the same type of people, different tribes. And they're in jungle territory, a lot of it. And therefore, you could have conflict there. The Mongols are different from the rest of the Chinese. The Shanghaiese speak a different language than the Beijingers on their daily life. They speak Shanghaiese, very fastest language in the world. 200 words a minute people speak. And the Beijingers can't understand. If you go and you can speak a bit of Mandarin, you can understand because they'll talk to you in Mandarin. But if you're from Beijing, it's like the Catalans and the Spanish. Nowadays the Catalans, if they meet a Spanish person, about 50% of them will pretend they can't speak Spanish and they'll talk to them in Catalan. If you're a foreigner and you speak to them in Spanish, they'll reply to you in Spanish. They can all speak Spanish. But of course, not everybody in Beijing can speak Shanghaiese. Not everybody in Spain can speak Catalan. And so the potential for the breakup of China does exist. And therefore, contrary to what was expected by sinologists, that's experts on China, by economists, by political scientists, and you can go through all the books. I've read pretty much all the books on politics and modern economics in China, published in English. Pretty much, I said. Now, it's 8 years of PhD. That's what happens to you. And so I know for a fact that none of the analysts of China predicted a return towards centralized control. None of them predicted a return towards public ownership as the dominant form. They all said the opposite, because they believed that with the emergence of a middle class, that ideas of private property would gain dominance, and that the private property ideas would lead to a more and more participatory democratic system that would eventually give way to a generalized democratic republic, like America or India.
Your voice sounds like it's going to give way.
It's going, yeah, I know.
I want to ask you one question though. If you have this China which is like threatening to split up, kind of like Russia has been kind of disintegrating a little bit as well, do you think that maybe if you're a hawk in the Chinese Communist Party, that using a potential conflict with America might be a good way to keep the state unified? I mean, this is why I say it's possible that China could not. It's not just that America is the one antagonizing China. China could look for ways to antagonize America.
Well,
because it would allow
they have done
to
so.
This cause to rally around a
Basically,
unified country. That's what
basically,
war does. It unifies a state.
But the issue is, China, as a state, has never really invaded foreign powers. Never really. You could say Tibet, but Tibet was Chinese over many, many centuries as well. It's a disputed issue.
Well, economically, they're taking on half the world, aren't they?
Now, economically, but that's slightly different. America, for example, when it wants economic dominance of a country, it makes deals with them, and if they don't agree, it puts pressure on them, and if they still don't agree, it bombs them. That's basically the pattern of development. Now, of course, it's not everywhere and all the time, but basically that's how it. I'll take you one sec. That's basically how the pattern works. So, the Chinese are based on controlling the internal economy. Even the Belt and Road Initiative in China has not really been undertaken for the purposes of global dominance, although it's been interpreted that way. Actually, China's moved towards the Belt and Road, in other words, to link together 60% of the world economy by rail routes, by road routes, and by shipping lanes. The purpose of this is to cope with the overproduction of commodities inside China. China has built enough houses, in fact, more than enough houses, for the whole population in the last 20 years. In the last 5-year plan, they built 36 million public sector, either for cheap sale or for cheap rent, to urbanize Chinese society. Still, they are building about 10 million, 7 to 10 million homes a year, even though there is more than enough housing in China to house everybody. It's estimated there are 60 million empty housing plots in China. So the housing problem has been solved, which the Soviet Union never did, East Germany never did, Poland, all these countries failed to do this. China has solved this.
The houses are away from the east of China, the centre of China, where all the rich Chinese are living, and they're trying to spread the poor parts outwards. Hence, it's so poor.
Well, I don't quite agree.
In the far west.
Basically, they developed the West, they developed the eastern seaboard, Shanghai, Tianjin, all the eastern seaports. That's where most of the foreign trade activity happens. Something like 70% of foreign trade of China is from the provinces on the coast. The interior of China is still undergoing the process of development that Shanghai, Tianjin, Beijing experienced over the last 30 years. So if you go inland... Sorry? You're not like, it's like the tractors, how many tractors we've built this year. You're starting to sound like that. Well, no, because you argued that the poorer area is expanding. Actually, what's happening is that the development process that took place in the eastern seaboard is moving inland. Now, that is still industrialisation development, and there are many flaws with that industrialisation development program. Just like you say about Soviet economic development, Chinese economic development is also flawed in many of its developments.
What you said about the provinces of China and the different races and the different languages and the different things going on in China, that's where the neglect is happening, or the sort of the tower block hellholes.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's your point?
That's where they're
I just arrived. What's your point of
I'm not trying to make a specific point. I was talking about the conflict between China and America.
But I think, since I'm European and you are, this points out as well how important it is that we have a strong Europe that sticks together.
That's really not the subject here. That's not the subject.
No, that's
Should I get on the ladder?
You're welcome to get on any ladder you like, but you're not taking my ladder. There's plenty of other space in this park. If you want to argue about the European Union, the truth of the matter is, madam, unfortunately, we're all sick to death of talking about Europe. We want to go when we hear the word. You know, not because we're against Europe or in favour of Europe. We're just sick to death of it. Sick to death of it. Both sides of the argument talk shit. That's the truth. Sorry?
I thought this was free.
Yeah, no, not in this way. It's in this Marxist meeting.
What's that going to do with it?
Okay.
And what's that going to do? I'm speaking what I think. That's my free speech.
And don't you want comments?
Of course I want comments. I'm just saying that's not the subject we're talking about at the moment.
I apologize.
You want to talk about that, we can do it another time. I've spoken many times. I said today I'm speaking on China and the conflict with China. It's a big subject. There are lots of people. I attended a meeting here last week. Lots of people are interested in this subject. So I thought, okay, I'll add to the discussion, which gets put on YouTube, so that people can engage and raise the level of discussion rather than wander from subject to subject during the meeting.
As well,
China claims they have taken out 500 million people out of poverty. Is that right?
700 million.
Is that right? So they are bringing people into the...
They brought people into the modern world.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes, hundreds of millions more people, and this relates to the question of Europe in this way, is that the Europeans are unable to cope with refugees coming here, but China copes with 17 to 18 million people, new people, moving to the cities every year. And that's really what's going on in Europe. People are moving from poor places to wealthier places. That's what it's about. That's what the migration's about. People from Africa living in poverty want to live okay. They see on television, they see on their mobile phone, look how they live in England, look how they live in Germany, look how they live in Italy. And they say, why the hell do I have to live in a place that is in the economic condition of a cesspit? And I'm going to move. And so they do move. Same in China. But in China, they're able to cope with it because public sector economy dominates the economy and drives development forward. And so the model they use for Shanghai is then applied to the interior of China as well. Public sector development attracts private sector economy and develops the economy. That is a model that they can apply anywhere. And it's my belief that that model can be applied anywhere in the world, not based on the rule of a single party. You can have a multi-party democracy dominated by public ownership and still raise the living standards of the people. And that's why I believe there is this systemic conflict is about the battle by America, which is becoming more authoritarian, against the battle against China, which is authoritarian. But even though it is authoritarian, the level of development of consciousness and communication amongst the masses means that it's not like Stalinist Russia. I lived in East Germany before the Berlin Wall came down. At that time, we had no mobile phones, we had no faxes, we had no printing machines. We had to get the Colombian ambassador to smuggle a bloody printing machine over for us because they weren't checked on the border. I had to smuggle literature in my bag full of books like the Bible and stuff. I smuggled communist literature, alternative communist literature into East Germany because everything was banned in East Germany. And you had secret, I've got a Stasi file from them watching over me. So they had secret police apparatus to watch the people. But in East Germany, despite all that, when the masses took to the street, the regime collapsed in 5 days. And so it would be in any country. And in China, modern communications links together the urban masses. Even a tiny event, if you go to Beijing or Shanghai or Tianjin, any major city, you'll see a cyclist pedals past, bumps into someone, argument breaks out, police come. Next thing, there's 50 to 100 people. They don't shout at the people arguing about the bicycle. They shout at the police.
Oh, really?
Yes, that's standard everyday experience in China. When the workers go on strike in China, there are more strikes in China than America, more strikes in China than India. It's a standard practice to go on strike in China. The workers have rights, contrary to what you're told. It's not a nation of slaves. It's a nation of educated, developing people. Confident, strong, feeling power, like Britons, French and Germans did in the 1960s, when the economy was developing, when everybody knew, if I leave this job, I could get a job down the road. If I leave that job, I could get a job down the road, and it'll pay me more money, because they want my hands and my brain. That's how it was in the 60s in Europe. That's how it is in China today. And the consequence of that is the workers are strong, they're powerful, they can protest, they can strike, they can organize. The consequence of that, well, to the degree that they're allowed to organize, the consequence of that is why the Communist Party has turned left. That's why Xi Jinping attacks corruption. That's why they focus on raising living standards at the expense of the private sector. At the expense of the private sector. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a good thing. It's a good thing. But I believe ultimately, as a Marxist, that ultimately the workers themselves, now they're educated, Now they're cultured. They will be able to take over the running of society and administer the society themselves. And with modern communication technology, with the knowledge of companies, the knowledge base of companies like Alibaba, which links together all the main factories and even the small factories in China. There you have it in Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was one computer database of all the companies in Russia. And these companies had no intercommunication with each other, apart from their specific trade connection. Alibaba's got universal, lateral communication between these companies. And therefore the information database that they have, the big data available, would allow the economy to be planned democratically by the consumer and by the producer. And that, ladies and gentlemen, would be genuine communism. That officially is what they want. But whether they would get there the way they're doing it is another question.
So the information is there, but people usually are flooded with information that they don't know to analyze it, they don't know to choose which one is true and which one is not. So can you give me an example of a country where the workers did the analysis correctly? And
well, I believe the example can be extrapolated in the following way. In China today, there are 100 companies, 102 companies that control the economy. 102, the whole economy. They control it because they're the biggest companies. It's the big state-owned enterprises, from steel industry to car production to banking. They control the economy.
Private ones like Huawei, I mispronounced.
Huawei.
Huawei.
Yeah, funny name.
Thanks.
There are some significant private companies, but the profits of the 3 largest state-owned companies in China are bigger than the profits of the 500 largest private companies. So you've got a disproportion of what we call, in Marx's terminology, or in general terminology, the commanding heights of the economy. They dominate the key sectors of the economy, which drive the direction. And that is why China did not collapse economically after 2008. When the Western economies collapsed because the profit rate had declined, they withdrew their investments because investment decisions are made by private entrepreneurs to make a profit. But in China, they're not decided that way. Profits are manufactured because the bank, if you're a state-owned company and he's a private company and you're in the same marketplace, but I want you to carry out my policies, even if you're less efficient, I give you the money at 2% interest, I give him the money at 30% interest. And in that way, I stifle the private sector and promote the public sector. That is how planning is implemented in China. They have 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 50-year plans in order to develop the economy based on those principles. And officials are appointed or removed depending on whether they fulfill those policies. So commanding heights of the economy can, in my opinion, not only be bureaucratically controlled, like an army, but can also be democratically controlled by the people's will in setting the priorities they believe in and then monitoring control of implementation.
How does that work?
Well, I believe that
if you're just one solitary China, if you're one solitary China, how do you express your democratic will at the expense of the 102 largest companies, for example, or anything at the expense of the party?
Well, the gentleman was asking about democracy. Democracy in the West also entails.
I'm asking about China.
I know, but I'm trying to draw the two things together so you understand about democracy and administration. So in China, administration is not democratic. Not in the Western sense of democracy. If you're a member of the Communist Party, for example, if you're not a member of the Communist Party, you can't criticize the government openly and organize around that criticism. You can make criticisms, but you can't organize around it. Or publish to large-scale groups. For example, if you've got like a Chinese communication, a WeChat. If on a WeChat group you've got more than 500 people and you send a message that gets sent out by them, that's political, you can be arrested for that. But if you have the largest companies and you have priorities that you set or that you argue for, if there was political competition and you argue, even if it was internal Communist Party competition, and they argue for different viewpoints about what should be prioritized, the ecology, the production, consumption, housing, healthcare, education, the normal priorities that in any Western democracy are also the bread and butter of discussion. I believe you could have democratic participation on those lines. And inside the workplaces, actually the democratic structure, exists in China. You have something called staff and workers representative councils in China, where the management of any company, private or state or cooperative, it is elected and can be removed if they don't carry out the plans that the people want. And and every year the management have to present to the staff and workers representative council whether they've implemented the plans and subject themselves to election and recall. In most cases, because of the dictatorial nature of the state as a whole, people will go along with what the management says. However, there are many cases, sufficient to be a tendency, where the workers of Terman and use this instrument as a mechanism of conflict. For example, in the 2010 strike in Honda, in the Honda factory, workers came out on strike. The joint venture, the Chinese joint venture, Guangdong Car something or other, which is a publicly owned entity, all car factories in China that are joint ventures with foreign companies must have 50% Chinese, 50% state. 50% state-owned, 50% foreign. And then they transfer the technology, copy it, and produce cars for the general market in China. So that's how this technology transfer process works. Now, when there was a strike in Honda, the workers demanded a wage increase. The management refused to participate in discussions, so the workers elected their own trade union management. And they negotiated with the bosses, and then they elected their own workers' representative council. It lasted for a couple of years. Then they took a few people out and turned it into a passive organization. But the potentiality is there. And if you've studied the nature of communist regimes, communist party regimes, and when they fall from power, the period of crisis, like Gorbachev's era, like 1956 Hungary, 1968 Czechoslovakia, 1953 East Germany, 1989 East Germany, 1989 Bulgaria, Romania. You study what happened in these countries. Generally it's the case that a section within the Communist Party itself turns and advocates a democratic form of administration. Often it was associated with ideas, what they called self-management, like in Yugoslavia. And when they advocate such policies, a split breaks out and one faction competes against another. And also a capitalist faction competes. I believe that despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, all the evidence in China points to the fact that the party still enjoys overwhelming support from the population. And so if a left-wing democratic faction develops inside the Communist Party, the potential for establishment of a genuine communist regime exists. And in fact, based on Marx's theories, that the growth of the working class is the precondition for socialism, that the development of production is the precondition for socialism, that culture, technology and science are the preconditions for socialism, China is the perfect place for genuine communism to begin. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go on.
Who owns the land in China?
State-owned. State-owned.
All the farmland?
There are some collectives still, what used to be the people's communes, and sometimes the village will own the land. But ultimately, the state still owns. So what they did after 1979 was they allowed land to be leased. So you could get a 30-year lease on the land. If you buy a property anywhere in China, there's no freehold in China. It's all leasehold. So generally it's 70 years. If you're lucky, you'll get 150, but most of them 30 to 70 years.
Why is there so much encouragement for urbanization? Why not just develop the land and the countryside? Because going too fast, problems of its own.
It's a perfectly legitimate question. It's because the bureaucracy which rules China has the mindset of military leaders. Don't forget, they came out of the military. The Chinese bureaucracy is a bureaucracy created in war.
They get the tanks out straight away.
Well, it's not
they
just
get the police out.
Not only created in war, let me remind you, created in
that's
genocide.
not really true.
Mao Zedong
They
killed
have
more people than Stalin and Hitler combined.
more people died under Mao
As a
Zedong.
consequence of his policies.
Well, that's debatable, but anyway, yes.
Okay.
I'll give you that. Well, let me answer his first. Let me answer his first, and I'll come to it. So, urbanization is because the bureaucracy focuses on its achievable objectives, and the more simple the objectives are, the easier it is to achieve them. So, if it's say build 50,000 housing units in this city, it's easier to achieve than say make every single housing unit that exists high quality housing with all the specific commodities inside it. That's a lot more difficult to achieve. And so they focus on targets like a military will do.
Or like Hitler. Or like Benito Mussolini.
Yes, to some degree. To some
Is
degree.
this accessible? I mean, I'd be the first to recognise, because by the way, since we last talked, I trade with China, and I've seen an enormous, if I compare to the world's largest democracy, just on the other side of the Himalayas, anarchy, no one can build an airport, few airports that they have, not enough spaces for anyone to land. Capitalism doesn't really work that well in India. Go back to China, everything's decided centrally by possibly a benevolent dictatorship. We can debate what that is. But at the end of the day, no one, unlike in India, is allowed to say, gee, we don't like you, fuck off. You know?
Well,
you'd end up in a cell before you can count to 10.
My experience is as follows.
Is that a price worth paying? I don't know, I'm asking you.
My experience is as follows. I was in China in 1989, at the time of Tiananmen Square. So I'm familiar with what you're talking about. I saw it myself firsthand. So, well, let me answer you. Firstly, that protest movement lasted 3 months in the main square of the city. Main square of the city. Not many countries would tolerate that. The regime, one minute.
Drive tanks across the
You allow me to explain? I was present, I understand what happened, I observed what, and I studied what happened. What's that? What?
There was an American company that put the picture of the tanks, and they refused to trade with them, and they were forced to take the picture.
So what?
No, it's wrong. Democracy. You're talking about democracy.
I'm not talking about
China
democracy.
Doesn't have it. It will split up like the Soviet Union.
You're talking
in 20
specifically.
Years. China will
you're just
split up like
mouthing
the
off.
Soviet
You're not
Union
giving a.
in
You're
20 years
not giving
time.
an argument.
No, I'm not
you're
giving
mouthing
any
off.
bullshit.
You're mouthing off to me.
I asked the question. Let me just hear the answer. Is it a price worth paying? That's what I want to know.
So my experience is this. In 1989 in East Germany, you could not express your point of view openly without at least the potential, because in your circle of friends, somebody would be a police agent and would be reporting on you. So I've got a Stasi file from those days, even though I only had relatively small contact with people. Now, people I know who were involved in the opposition movement, a friend of mine, Uwe Bastian, got 4 Stasi files that big. Right? So, I'm familiar with the surveillance state that existed in East Germany. In China in 1989, as distinct from East Germany in 1989, they had faxes, they had photocopying machines, they had an ability to organize that didn't exist in Eastern Germany, largely because China is a vast country, which even the strongest Communist Party dictatorship will not be able to say to the people exactly what they want them to do. And therefore, if you say, you do this, in the provinces, something quite different, even with the same words, something quite different will happen. So it's not as simple as saying the Communist Party controls everything in China. Not as simple as that.
It controls the media. It controls the internet.
It does control the media.
And that is ultimately
it does
the
control the
of
internet.
minds.
But don't forget,
that is the big difference.
No internet existed in East Germany in 1989.
Oh, that's
no
not quite
internet
true.
existed
You could,
in Russia
you could stick
in
your
1989.
satellite dish and point to the Bundesrepublic.
But so what?
And the majority of
in the
people in the
Bundesrepublik,
DDR did watch Western
Yes,
news.
but Western television.
And were able to interpret.
Western television was broadcast to the East Germans since the inception of television in 1950
Well, it became more
in
and more
East Germany.
accessible as time went on.
1949 was
But that's not the case.
it
in
was
China.
universally accessible. But the problem is this: it had no impact on the East Germans.
I don't agree.
Well, the
East
regime.
Germans are now more capitalist than the West Germans.
A lot of
East
nonsense.
Germany are more
A
capitalist.
lot of nonsense.
Of course it is.
Complete
Have you
nonsense.
been to East Germany recently?
Yes, I've lived in East Germany.
The pendulum has
I lived
swung.
in East Germany before the Berlin
There's a
Wall,
grain of truth
and I've
in
lived
what he
in East
says.
Germany since the Berlin Wall was taken down. And I tell you this, there's a survey done every single year of social opinion in Germany. It's been done before the Berlin Wall was put up, done since the Berlin Wall was put up, done after the Berlin Wall was taken down. And they ask the question every year. The government asked the question, do you believe that socialism is a good idea that wasn't carried out in practice?
It's an
And
academic
in
question.
West Germany,
Utterly irrelevant.
it's about 55%. In East Germany, about
Utterly irrelevant
80%.
question.
Consistently 80%.
There isn't a 5-year-old out there who doesn't say that Marxism and the sharing of all goodies
turning and
and all
twisting.
sweeties equally is not a good idea. It doesn't work in function. That's what's interesting. I don't know why. Maybe
How am I
mankind
turning
is
twist? I'm
cynical
trying
and
to
corrupt.
answer. I'm
But
trying
let's-
to answer the questions
I'm
you asked.
particularly interested in
So
the
the key
media.
question was this.
You're advocating the Chinese system.
Yeah.
I believe democracy has had a major undermining in recent years due to the Pandora's box of the internet. Now I want to know, are you in line with Xi Jinping in terms of taking control of the access of information, which the Chinese now have limited?
I write for the Chinese media.
That's
I've
not
had
the
an
answer to the
opinion.
question.
Well, I'm answering you because here I am speaking what I
Chinese
think.
Daily News is hardly a free organ, is it?
I write for China.org.cn. You can check it on the internet. And I've had an opinion column with them since 2009. So 10 years I've been writing for them.
Subject to you being in line with the editorial board.
Not at all. No, because they don't have an editorial position.
They don't.
In fact, I have been able to write on Chinese government websites more openly than I've been able to write in Western
Well, they know
socialist
you're
websites.
devoted to their thesis.
Well, no.
Always
I
have
will.
been.
If you want to know about the Chinese media, I can tell you about it
Okay,
because
look,
I work
okay,
for them.
I'm-
right?
Okay, absolutely.
I work for the
But
equivalent
you're not
of the Chinese.
exactly expelling revolutionary ideas at the expense of the existing nomenclature.
Do you want to read what I wrote
Okay, tell me
before
how.
you tell me
Okay,
what I wrote?
I admit. So tell me how subversive you've been today.
I write what I believe in the line with what I've been discussing here throughout this afternoon.
So far, I haven't
write,
heard you actually saying anything contrary to the Communist Party of China.
I'm not arguing against the Communist Party of China,
Well, what if you did?
but I'm not.
But what if you wanted to?
I argue against certain policies they carry out, but I'm not arguing against the Communist Party as a
But
whole.
what if
I don't want to.
I mean, personally,
There are many people,
Given the choice
however.
between
There are
Putin
many.
and
Hang
Trump.
on, let me make this clear.
Xi
I am a
Jinping-
minority amongst the Western writers in the Chinese press. There's about 20 people who write for the Chinese press who are from abroad. Right? I'm in a minority amongst them in that I advocate communism. Most of them advocate capitalism and Western democracy. Most of them. And most of the newspapers in China, most of the media in China advocate capitalist regimes. They advocate capitalism. So I'm a small minority within the Chinese press and within the Western observers and commentators
small
within
minority
the
of
Chinese
writing in
press.
English. It's important to say.
Writing in English, but it's also
If you were writing
many
in
of them.
Mandarin,
Many of them
there
are
would be
also.
unlimited
Many of
people
my articles
writing
are
in
also
favour.
published in Chinese.
Well, that's neither here nor there. The huge majority support the party when they write in Mandarin, i.e., the language of the locals.
On the contrary,
Well-
if you look at the websites, Baidu, you look at the websites 888.
Baidu is a search engine.
The overwhelm. They still got websites and they feed news to people like Yahoo does. If you look at them, the overwhelming majority of articles in the Chinese press are pro-capitalist. pro-capitalist.
Well, arguably.
They don't declare themselves against the Communist Party, but they are pro-capitalist.
But arguably, the party is now a capitalist system of
Well, I disagree.
organisation.
I disagree.
Okay?
And
But-
so does the state,
but-
so does the
but
party,
I would like to put-
so does the party's
Can we-
programme and policies, so does membership of the party entail that
Can
you
we-
believe
can-
in
can we
communism,
just put
and so does
aside
the Chinese
question
constitution.
as to whether it is, quote, capitalist
So
or
you are
communist.
allowed to argue in the Chinese press for capitalism to be the dominant form of production,
But you're not
even
allowed
though,
to
even
call-
though, one minute, even though it is against the rules of the party, even though it's against the constitution of China. You're allowed to argue those points. And those views dominate the Chinese press. So it's not true what you're saying. However,
Young man, whatever you're saying here, I definitely give you the right to speak. My opinion is you're hand in glove with the Communist Party of China, and your views, to a certain extent,
He's on their payroll.
yeah.
I'm
Say
oh
no more. Say no
right. So if I
more.
work the local
Say no
council,
more.
I say what the local council wants. No,
Well, you're getting paid by these websites, I assume.
of course I am. What about it?
Well, fair enough. Who pays for those websites to exist?
Journalism.
The party.
The Chinese state, yes.
Exactly. So you are basically working for the Communist Party of China.
I'm sorry, but if you read what I write, then
It
you
doesn't
can give
matter,
your
but
opinion.
you're working for it. They're paying you.
Well, I mean, so what?
I mean,
I
okay,
told
so
you
what?
that. You didn't tell me. I told you
Okay,
that.
we agree. I just
So
want
what
to
about it?
clarify that.
You're basically saying,
That's fine.
you're basically saying, as a journalist, if I write for a journal, I'm a prostitute for them.
No.
There's
Well,
a
arguably,
reason.
if you're a
There is
journalist,
a
you're a
reasonable
prostitute
case.
for whichever
There is a
proprietor
reasonable
you're
case for that.
working for. I mean,
But in
that's-
my
that's given.
circumstances,
What
it's
we're
not
trying
true.
to say to you are following the steps of checkbook journalism.
You see, you don't listen, do you?
Well, I mean,
Even when I say what I just said, you didn't listen to a word I said.
he's an
I just
incredibly
said,
indulgent
I said if
position,
somebody
being able to
writes,
say
I said it's, what did I just say?
whatever he
What did I
feels
just say before
in
you
a
said that?
Okay, I'll give you the time.
What did I say before you said that?
You are a checkbook.
What did I say before you said that?
You sent to me, I work for the communists. I write communists.
You didn't listen to what I said.
You said
Well, I
to me,
repeat
I'm
what I
not a
said
capitalist.
for your ignorance, but you can look it up on YouTube.
Thank you, sir.
I said,
You should learn to be
I
a bit
said,
more graceful by
journalists,
using those
I
words.
said journalists.
Standing on that chair, you should learn to be a bit more graceful than come up with words like
shut up.
ignorance.
Shut up.
That's it, you come up with
I
a
want
shut
to
up.
ask, the Western market seems to be extremely volatile. I mean,
Western what?
Western markets in terms of shares, for example, share prices are extremely volatile. Under the Chinese system, they seem to be much more stable. How do the Chinese policymakers make it so stable so that we don't get the same volatility that we get?
Shares in the West are, in theory, part ownership of a company. So the shareholder can, in theory, go to a meeting and say, I want to remove the board management. If they get enough votes, supposedly they can do it. It's not actually how it works, but that's the theory. In China, you own shares. For most of the shares, you don't own jack shit.
No.
You don't own part of the company. You can't tell them what to do. You can sell it for a profit if it goes up. You can sell it for a loss if it goes down.
No, right.
But you don't control the company because you've got shares. That's the
Hang on,
difference.
hang on. Either it's a share.
Stock market.
Either it's a
not
share-
really a stock market.
Either it's a share, and it is a share of a company, and therefore has intrinsic value, which is why people speculate on it. Or it's not a share. Which one is it?
Well, it's not a share of the company.
No, but
Well,
It's
it
not
doesn't-
like the
it
stock
gives you- I
market
don't-
in the West.
It gives you no voting rights, maybe.
No power.
But
You
do
don't
you
own the
actually
company
own
either.
a proportion of the
No,
profits?
no, because
that pour in?
50% of the shares are owned by the state.
And they're basically exploiting that fact every
Yes,
time.
the
there's a share
Chinese
on.
stock market is a mechanism for extracting money from the middle class to fund the state investment.
So it's basically thievery.
It's not thievery.
Well, what is it? Why else would somebody buy a share?
Because
I'm
they wanna
interested.
make some money.
Because I'm right. Well, exactly. But is it basically an act of faith? I mean, are we buying
course it is.
bitcoins? Is it bollocks?
Well, yes,
Okay.
but it's a mechanism.
I'm not
for
sure
the-
I'd want to spread that rumour around. Xi Jinping might find an awful lot less money
It's not a secret.
to spend.
It's not a secret. People gamble on the stock market prices. If the shares go up, they can sell those shares and make more money. If the shares go down,
but
they lose money. But
You
they
make-
don't
you make
own
more
the
money
company as a
because-
consequence.
You make more money
That's all.
because the belief of your belief
In
is that
Britain-
the company
No.
is now worth more
I'm
money.
sorry, in Britain, if you've got dominant shareholders, if you've got 3 dominant shareholders, they can't be ousted at a shareholders meeting. by the ordinary pleb who owns 3 shares and goes along and says, "Oi, I don't want you anymore." They say, now take your vote, and your vote is based on how many shares you own.
There are plenty of companies.
So it is in China, but the state owns the majority of shares, so they control the game.
There are plenty of companies where 51% don't
And in fact,
get controlled by government.
this is where people have misunderstood. Most of the economists in the world who said China has become capitalist, what they didn't bother to investigate was what these capitalist companies are. There are companies listed on the Chinese stock market called limited companies. There are other companies listed on the Chinese stock market called shareholding companies. These companies aren't privately owned. They're owned by other state companies. One state company owns another company, owns another company, owns another company. Sometimes 30%, sometimes 50%, sometimes 90%, sometimes 20%, but they know they control the board. And therefore it doesn't matter if private people invest. They control the game.
You know the top 10 banks in the world, about 6 of them are Chinese, the top 10 banks in the whole world.
Yes.
It's incredible how much...
It's the same there. If you own, in China, if you own the Speaker's Corner Cafe, and you go at the end of the day and you put your money in the bank, it goes to the Communist Party and the state for investment. That's how they organise. In Britain, you go to the bank, you put the money in the bank, it goes to the private company called Barclays Bank, and they spend it or don't spend it as they choose, right? To make money for the bank owners, not for the people, but for the owners of the bank.
Would you say that's why the Americans are desperate for a fight now, because they know in the long term China's going to get stronger and stronger?
Of course they know. They know they will lose to China.
So they
If they're allowed to continue the present way, China will defeat America. Of course it will. They've got 4 times the population. Massive rate of economic growth. 6-7% economic growth. Within 15 years, China will overtake America.
Can they fight on multiple...
In dollar terms, overtake America. And therefore the shape of the world economy will be reorganized around the Chinese economy rather than the American economy. And therefore the Americans have to have a conflict now with China, trade war now, that can escalate into different types of conflicts.
So what about dollar? What about dollar? Dollar. What about dollar currency?
Well, the key thing as far as the American, this is why Belt and Road is the red flag to the Americans, is because the Americans control the sea. Britain, we used to say, Britons never will be slaves. Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. That's why we had the biggest empire in the world. We had a navy that was double the size of any other navy. And we could bomb the other countries with our navy and control the supply of goods across the entire world. The navy wasn't there to protect Britain or to export democracy. The British Navy was there to make sure that when Britain transports goods from other parts of the world, that we guarantee the supply of those goods. That they arrive in London, they arrive in Liverpool, backed by the British Navy. And the Navy lost out in 1926 to the Americans. Since 1926, America controls now 2/3 of the world's shipping lanes. And that's why when Pilger, bless you, when Pilger made his film, he points this out. China's seas are surrounded by American Navy and American allies. What do you think the conflict in Korea is about? Kim Jong-un? Kim Jong-un's irrelevant. The issue is the Americans have their navy in South Korea. They have their navy in Taiwan. They have their navy in the Philippines. They have their navy in, what's the other one, sorry? Japan. And so because of this, they control the seas coming out of China. And so they can bomb them and stop the division, stop the supply. And so the Belt and Road is a mechanism to connect Europe, Eurasia and Africa by a road and rail network and shipping lanes that will bypass American hegemony. That's why the Americans are screaming about the islands being built in the South China Sea, which is nowhere near America after all. It might be near the Philippines, but it's thousands of miles from America. But America doesn't want the competitor power to dominate the shipping lanes. And so therefore, at some stage, the conflict had to come to a head. And now it has.
See the Belt and Road Initiative. They're debt trapping nations all over.
What's that?
China, they're debt trapping nations.
Well, you say they're debt trapping, but they're not. Well, it might look like that because they give them loans.
Yeah, it's a
But
loan
the
to
Chinese,
country.
when they give the Chinese, when they give a loan, just the same as a state loan inside China. You get a loan from a bank in China, a state-funded loan, and you can't pay the loan back. They just kick the can down the road. They spread the loan over 30 years, or 50 years, or 100 years.
What about the port in Sri Lanka where they now own the port now because Sri Lanka's
Well, what's the big
back?
deal? They still got a port.
But if I know you can't pay a debt back, but I still get the money from you, isn't that
They get the
treacherous?
asset. Do they actually get money out of it?
It's an asset. Of course
Do
it
they
is.
make money out of the Sri Lankan port?
Of course it is.
The amount of money they pumped in?
course
What's
it
the
is.
rate of return then?
You're not sure, but
What's
it's
the
part
rate of
the
return?
Belt initiative, isn't it?
Yeah, Belt and Road.
Yes, it's their initiative. But the idea that if the Chinese take over an asset, that therefore they're asset stripping, that's false. They built the bloody port.
They did.
Right, so Sri Lanka didn't have a port. Now it's got a port.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether it's owned by the
They
Chinese.
lent them the money, right?
Sorry? They lent them the money.
And then what-
They built the
they
port.
lent- yeah,
The
but
port is
if
there.
I know that
If the
Joe
Sri
Block-
Lankans are unable to manage it in a way that brings the return,
But if you
the
knew
Chinese
that,
keep
if
the
you-
port. They don't close it down.
If you knew that before you gave the money, then what? Is that
On the
right or
contrary, in nearly all of the trade relations, on large-scale projects like port projects, railroad projects, road projects, shipping projects, the Chinese are giving money to the countries that they are investing in. In nearly every single case.
What good will it bring to the country?
Take Venezuela. In Venezuela, they've given $50 billion to the Venezuelan government. The Venezuelan government can't pay any debts back. But the Chinese gave it. They're still giving them. The Americans, they delivered 20 tons of aid. The Chinese just delivered 70 tons of aid. Millions and billions of dollars they'll throw in to maintain the regime.
How's Iran fitting in with Iran and Russia in this relationship? Why is China...
The Iranians, the Russians, and many other countries. In fact, 60% of the world have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. Because it provides high-speed rail, high-speed communication, it provides new shipping lanes, new road routes that bypass American power.
But what will happen to those countries? Will they benefit? Will the countries benefit? Because it's a loan to the country. It's a loan to the country.
What makes you think that it's fundamentally an act of anti-American?
Well, it's not purely anti-American. The point is the Americans regard it that way. America, Britain, France, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, they carved up Africa. They plundered Africa. When they came and gave a loan, they gave a loan which goes into the hands of Mobutu and into the Swiss bank, right? In exchange for copper from Mozambique. And therefore you have nothing, right? You don't have the copper, you don't have the money's gone to Switzerland. So everything is gone. When the Chinese invest, they invest in material resources on the ground. And therefore, whether it becomes Chinese through a debt trap, or whether it remains in the hand of the indigenous government, is irrelevant. It's there. The facility is there. The Congo, for example. In the Congo, the Chinese built a copper mine. 9 billion investment. That copper mine provides copper for the Chinese. In exchange, they built roads, high-speed rail, schools, and hospitals. Things the people in the Congo require to live and to raise themselves out of poverty.
Why is that
They're building high-speed rail. They are building high-speed rail between every city in Africa of over 500,000 people. The intention is by 15 years' time that every city of over 500,000 will have a railway network going at 300 miles, 300 kilometers an hour from one city to another. Something the British, 15 years' time, something the British in 150 years never did. So what did they do? In India, they started out doing that, but then they abandoned it. In Argentina, they did it. 60,000 kilometers of railway, abandoned. You can go there now, all abandoned. So this is the infrastructure of the future. That is why America regards it as a threat to their power.
It is not colonizing.
It is not because the Chinese want to fight the Americans, it's because the Americans want to prevent the rest of the world from developing
First of all, you
along
mustn't talk
Chinese
about
line,
America
or
as if
even
you're
developing
talking
at all.
about China. America, for better or for worse, is a democracy. And actually the president didn't win the maximum number of votes. His opponent won more votes than he did. So there is a huge, at minimum, minority who disagree with so-called American politics. That is not
Policy is not made. Policy. This is a bipartisan policy. The
No,
Democrats
what? No.
and
The
the
Democrats
Republicans.
believe
the
in
Democrats,
free trade.
The Democrats and the
I've
Republicans.
never heard Obama complaining about Belt and Road policies.
Well, that's not true. Obama began the policy of pivot to Asia, which was to isolate China and put in sea bases around China to prevent development.
I don't see what
trade.
we were talking about Africa a second ago. I don't see. Obama never said there was anything wrong with, say, building a railway line from Addis Ababa to
You're wrong.
Djibouti.
You're wrong.
Well, when did
Under
it?
Obama, they began the fear that China was taking over Africa. And
No.
newspaper articles, one after another, false articles,
Hang on,
by
we
the
have
way,
free press
in the
in-
Western press,
for better
in
or
the
for
Western
worse, there's a
free
free press
press,
in the United States.
false articles
There
were
is
published
no
in
official-
all the Western media about Chinese influence in
But
Africa.
that's not the
saying,
government.
Well,
Which government official actually said we should stop Chinese investment in Africa?
it's been American policy.
Can you name one? Did the Secretary of State of America, John Kerry, say we should stop Chinese investment in Africa?
I mean, not Africa, but I'll come on to that.
Oh, all right.
In
So
2010,
we win 1 point.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton believed that China was engaged in a fundamental economic war with the West.
No, well,
I haven't.
she never
I
used the
can't
word
quote
war.
you.
She never
I
used the word
can't quote you the exact wording
because it never
of her.
existed. She never used the
I
word
will come back to it. However, on this YouTube video, at this point, I will post you statements by
Hillary
leading
Clinton
figures,
says the-
including
that
Hillary
the West
Clinton,
is at war.
about Western conflict with China over Africa. Yes, I will post that.
Conflict, yes.
And if I don't, I'll
It's
apologise.
an economic
However,
conflict.
yes, an economic
Of course
conflict.
it is. We're all trying to win influence.
An economic and military
and friends.
conflict. And the reason why Hillary Clinton freaked out about China was because China prevented Google from operating inside China. And that was then a declaration of economic and technological war
No, of
against the Chinese.
dictatorship and censorship. That's what it was. It was a declaration of censorship.
But we all know the truth now, don't we? The truth is,
But
Google,
China is not a free
Google
country.
was operating in 2010 as an arm of the American state to spy on the world.
Absolute bollocks.
Well, this was revealed by Ed Snowden. I'm sorry.
Absolute
It's
bollocks.
well proven, well documented.
Which is why
fact.
Google
Not an
has
invention.
allowed
Fact.
the echo chambers of both the far right and the far left, and the Chinese and the Russians, including Putin, to take control over large amounts. Google doesn't. Sergey Brin came out of a communist
I
dictatorship.
agree with you. Yeah, but one thing I would say, if you have this talk in China, you will be considered as a hero.
You'll be arrested.
No, he wouldn't. It wouldn't be. But the problem of China is the Western and Eastern, the value have a clash. It's not about economic only. It's about political value and culture, everything.
Can you be
It's
precise? What is the clash? I'm interested. Let's hear it from you.
It's conflict. Oh, okay. So we see
There's a
in this
widespread
country-
belief that there's some fundamental civilizational
Exactly.
differences. That's the argument.
Well, the thing is, we consider. Yeah, you need value. Yeah, we consider every individual has its right. Yeah. So individualism in this country is a good thing. But on the other hand, you go to Japan. If you try to be very individualist, you can be in trouble. Oh yeah, yes. When I was little, if you try everything, you raise your hand, you'll be in trouble. Your teacher will tell you off.
Yeah,
so this is
I worked
So the
for.
clash is about individualism against
collectivism.
I worked for
so
NEC
this is
for a
one
while.
of them. This is one of them, fundamental. Okay. So I agree with you, Stan. Okay, America as a power
superpower, new power is coming up, they will try to suppress them. That's every history.
But you
if
talk
you look
about America
Britain,
as if it's a collectivism, and it's a failed collectivism.
that's different thing. We're talking about.
Well, it's important.
British power.
Washington D.C. is
It's doing the same thing. It's done the same thing. Every power. Roman Empire. Britain used to be part of the Roman. It's the same thing. If you read the history, every empire, if it's going down, decline, new power coming, they will try to suppress it. That's normal. So everybody try to argue with that point.
Correct me if I'm wrong, previous decline and falls of empires, it resulted in people occupying, fighting back and taking control. I don't see that happening in the capitalist West. It seems to be an anarchy, really. I mean, a vaguely democratic anarchy. I don't see any desire, for example, Donald Trump has absolutely no desire to occupy another country. He's not prepared to put the military in harm's way, because he lives in the TV age and post-Vietnam War. You can't bring back a handful of American GIs in body bags. It's over. We don't occupy countries anymore and stick a flag in it and say, you're mine. That's the old system. Now we're talking about China understands this. So what they're doing in Africa is about economic influence. It's not about occupation. As far as I'm aware, they're quite happy to support any old dictator, so long as it's their dictator.
But ultimately, although what you're saying is true at this particular junction, don't forget that's not valid for 15 years ago. Okay. It's valid now, and I agree that is valid, and it's an important component in the present constellation of forces. So, for example, possibly
than what was done before.
For example, the attempted coup in Venezuela was directly backed by the Americans. It was almost certainly.
Some Americans.
Of course, some Americans.
It's really important.
But the important
you keep
Americans.
using the word Americans as if you're talking about the Chinese controlled by the party. America is not controlled by one party. It's an incredibly divided nation.
But it is not the internal divisions in America that are preventing them from organising the coup, or better said, there is no internal division in America which is opposing the coup at any significant level in the United States.
Plenty.
Almost none.
That shows you don't understand how democratic America is.
On the contrary.
There are plenty of people saying, pull out of Venezuela, don't mess your hand. Lots of people, lots of politicians.
Okay, I'm going to turn, just like you did a few minutes ago, I'm going to turn on you. Name me one significant figure.
John Kerry.
John Kerry.
Yeah, previous Secretary of State.
He said he's against.
Absolutely.
Okay, one.
And I'd be surprised if Hillary Clinton hasn't said something.
Even Bernie Sanders is supporting the coup.
No,
yes he is. And Cortez.
What we are supporting is democracy. Who cannot support democracy in Venezuela?
They're not supporting democracy.
At the moment, well, I'm supporting democracy in Venezuela.
Anyway, the point was this.
It doesn't mean.
The point was this.
It's
not
an
about
army to go in
the
and
point
get rid
was
of
this.
Maduro.
The Americans, no, the central point was about military. Will the military intervene? That was the question.
No,
so the central point being, the American military will not go to Venezuela.
Absolutely.
I think you're correct on that.
You're lucky that Henry Kissinger is not there.
Yeah, we're very lucky Henry Kissinger's not.
However, do not forget the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a military affair. Although military conflict was behind it, and there were a number of military conflicts in the run-up to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
I thought there was no
it
cash
was not
in the kitty
a military
to pay
affair.
for the military.
Not a military affair.
That is a military affair.
But not an East-West military affair. Well, if it is, then that's also a conflict. But there was no arms, there was no shootout at the OK Corral in Berlin or in Eastern Europe at all.
Absolutely.
Or in the Soviet Union.
Thank God.
Now, however, just as China's political economy and regime are changing, so America and the Western political regimes are changing. So now let's return to the point the woman raised earlier on. What is the future of the West? Is the Western future an expanding and flowering, democratic, successful capitalist world? Or is the Western future an increasing volatile and conflictual Western world, in which Donald Trump's era is but an interregnum in the developing crisis in the West, in which the Brexit vote and the crisis emerging with the emergent right wing in Europe is but a dynamic developing, not finished, developing at the moment.
Developing,
and in which,
on the
like
rise,
Kropotkin once said
on the
about
rise,
Europe,
but soon to be defeated, I hope.
Kropotkin once said about Europe, war is the natural state of Europe.
Absolutely.
And there are many factors in the dynamics in Europe which tend towards conflict rather than the resolution of conflict.
Historically, yes.
One of the reasons why the French and Germans desperately tried to hold together the European Union is because after us, the deluge. They believe, quite correctly probably, that if Europe does collapse, or when Europe does collapse, that conflict will inevitably emerge again. Germany will attempt to align with Russia to get resources to back up its industrial might. America will align with the East European states to try and isolate Germany from linking up with Russia. And this also is the second narrative of the Americans. Primary narrative, China. Secondary narrative, the enemies. Japan, Germany, Russia. They are the enemies of America. Because Japan is the main enemy of America. Because Japan is economically stronger and more cohesive internally than the United States of America. Therefore, Japan is considered...
The conflicts in the world, in my humble opinion, are basically a conflict between globalism and nationalism.
Well, I don't think that's the conflict anymore.
And
I think people like to make out that's the case. I don't think that's the case.
What we're looking at is a huge number of people, almost tribes, that have arisen from the Pandora's box of the internet. And they have a sense of connection with a group of people that, interestingly, can be quite disparatively positioned. And they feel that the world is becoming homogenous. Now, they may or may not be right. I personally am in favor of federalism. I believe that some decisions have to be made globally and some have to be made in the village. But that's what's going through right now. And we have second-rate democracy because it's suddenly become really easy for second-rate politicians, regional, provincial politicians, to blame all their failures on the abstract of Washington, D.C. or Brussels.
Why has it become easy?
Because it's bloody difficult. Because the internet.
In the era of globalization, why has it become easy?
Because the internet makes it so easy to gather up the force of your own localized echo chamber
That's the internet.
Right, okay?
It's the internet.
The internet is what's changed. That's the game change.
I'm sorry, that's not true.
Well,
in 1848, there were revolutions right across the continent of Europe. No internet.
I'm sorry, but...
No internet. And they spread in a matter of days from one country to another. 1989, in Eastern Germany,
Europe, since 1945.
We had no internet.
Since 1945.
We had no fax machines.
Since 1945, for 70 years,
1989.
we've had steady growth in a democratic society where there's been no wars within the European Union. So much has it been a success that any country that's been recently at war has got down on its knees and begged to be able to join this club. That's the reality. Now,
are you arguing?
Britain
Are you arguing?
Okay.
What's that?
Okay.
Well, he's been arguing quite a long time.
Well, okay.
Yes, I'm trying to get.
So
otherwise, I might as well leave and he can carry on.
There are those who believe in that federal model, which I have to be honest and say I generally subscribe to, and there are those who say, let's put up the walls.
Yeah, but
let's go for a Pol Potian nationalism.
What your argument is, it's a conflict of ideas.
A conflict
what you're arguing.
of philosophy. Two philosophies.
Philosophy. I don't think that's true.
And it's also about what you call localization, where you make decisions. Personally, if I was a Scot or a Catalan, I would be supportive of independence, but in the context of Europe.
I think
Westminster's become a joke of an organisation. I don't think it's ever been particularly democratic. Certainly by the standards of China, it's incredibly democratic. But we don't employ proportional representation and so on. It's a very unfair system. It's better than nothing, but it's not a good system. What do I support? I tell you what, I'm looking at the continent as a whole, as you rightly point out, the most violent corner of the world in the last 150 years. I actually think that maybe it's a good thing that England's leaving for the sake of the rest of Europe. I think if you look to see the rise of support for the European Union since Brexit in the rest of Europe, it's gone up dramatically. Even a populist right, who were prepared to say anything to get into power, have withdrawn their anti-European Union position because they know it's a vote loser.
But your fundamental argument is a philosophical argument. I don't agree.
It is.
Well, you said that. I'm trying to
Well,
answer.
tell me what
I'm not allowed to
democracy you
answer.
have in comparison to the
Am I allowed
European
to answer or
Union
not?
in the People's Republic
Can
of
I
China,
answer you
to
or
which
not?
you advocate. Yes, please.
This is not about philosophy. This is about the fundamentals of economics. When economic growth was happening, globalization became a dominant idea.
Economic philosophy.
When the economic development was happening, when capitalism was in expansion, then economic trade relations and political relations began to
May I
intertwine.
remind you there is still
Can I finish?
economic growth.
Can I finish?
But in fact, you say
were
it's
speaking
stopped.
for at
It
least
hasn't
10
stopped.
minutes.
Okay, but
I
keep
want to reply to what
everyone
you
has
said.
the right to their opinions, but stick to the
Well, I mean,
facts. No one has the right to their own facts. And there is
You gave
economic
your
growth
opinion.
as we speak.
Everything's
That's measurable,
opinion.
okay?
Your facts are
Speak
drawn
one
in
at a
to
time,
back
please.
up your opinion.
No!
There's no objective fact.
No, now you're supporting Michael Gove and saying we live in the post-factual age. That's
Well,
bollocks.
it's not purely
Facts are
objective
facts
fact.
are facts.
Well, there
you
are
haven't a
some
right to an
facts.
opinion,
Yes, okay.
but you don't have a
Okay,
right
so
to your
I'm
own
arguing
facts.
this.
Okay.
What you say is a fact is
Go
false.
on, economic.
It is
Yeah.
not
Economic
philosophy.
growth
The
exists
idea that
globally.
philosophy dominates the political decisions in this world is false. Fact number one, if you want. Why? Because economics is the foundation for the philosophy. The philosophy of globalization is rooted around the economic dynamic of globalization. And the philosophy of nationalism, of segregation, of Donald Trump, of Brexit, of the breakup of the European Union, is rooted, and the rise of nationalism internationally, it's not caused by modern communications technology. It's caused by the economic dynamics that followed from the crash of 2008 and the crisis that followed in many countries.
So no space for xenophobia, tribalism at all. It's all about money.
It is
It's all about money.
produced by the economic condition. Produced by the economic condition. And the factual evidence for that is historical. In 1929, the world was expanding economically. Once 29 happened, and the economic crash happened in America and Europe, Europe turned politically to nationalist hysteria and to communism. And those two forces, political forces, aligned around economic perspectives and economic agendas. Those two forces clashed in society and produced Adolf Hitler, the Spanish Civil War, the conflict in Europe, the French Popular Front government, 1936, and then the World War in 1939. So that's not some imaginary philosophical conflict between Adolf Hitler's philosophy and Winston Churchill's philosophy. It's a conflict about how you organize the world economically.
But that's philosophy.
Who controls?
But that's philosophy. What are you talking about is philosophy.
Economics.
Well, it's both.
Bertolt Brecht
Yeah,
used the
it's both.
phrase.
Because you two,
well,
you two
there is
actually
primary and secondary.
in the same boat.
Bertolt Brecht used to use the phrase, first feed the face and then talk right and wrong. First feed the face.
Okay, listen,
So
we
as a Marxist,
all agree that
hang on.
if you're not
One final
eating,
bit.
you're very vulnerable to any
you're not
populist who
good at
promises you
philosophizing.
any magical solution. We understand that. And we understand that the world
So
is
you
vulnerable
seem to believe
when
that
economics are going.
some clever idea came along. Catalan nationalism.
No.
Catalan nationalism existed under Franco. Because Franco repressed the Catalans, repressed the Catalan language, repressed Catalan beliefs.
All true.
But nevertheless, for decades, Catalan nationalism, basically it was just a minority viewpoint. No powerful force. They were granted autonomy to use the language. In fact, every sign had to be in Catalan and Spanish.
Catalan nationalism.
Only
I
after
hate
the
to tell you
economic
this.
crisis, of 2008
is mostly driven by a sense of
Catalan-
superiority and financial wealth, which they have in comparison to the rest of Spain.
Right, so why is that important?
Okay, well,
Why is that important?
But your example.
Now, why did
hang
that
on,
become
hang on.
significant
You're-
now?
you're
Because
19
suddenly everyone became a Catalan nationalist by a philosophical
you're-
change,
oh, you're
a
19
light bulb moment. What caused it?
Well, what caused it was repression.
What
If
caused?
Ma- if Madrid had, if Madrid,
Why did they call a
if-
vote?
If Madrid
Why
had
did they call a
allowed them to
vote?
separate in the context of Europe, they would have gone very peacefully,
Why,
and they'd
why
be
did it
negotiating
happen?
with Madrid.
Why did it happen?
Oh, it happened.
Why
because,
did they want independence?
Because central Madrid, central
Because
Spanish
Spain was an
politicians
economic burden on the Catalans. That's
handled
why.
it badly.
The Catalans,
Yeah, but that's
the
completely
second
different.
wealthiest area of
1920
Spain.
First of all,
They got southern Spanish people. The Catalans suddenly start saying, like people in England turn around and say, oh, these fucking foreigners are taking our jobs. The Catalan turn around and say, those lazy southern Spanish who want to play
that's
flamenco
a
all
world
day
of
and
difference
sit on their
between-
asses. They're not prepared to work like us upright Catalans.
Okay.
That's how it came
No,
to
there's a grain of truth in what you say.
They have the right to say that if the Catalan are more.
I'm saying, why did they say it? Not because the philosophy was new. The philosophy's old as the hills.
So basically, everyone's
Catalonia
in it for
had an
themselves.
empire. Rome was
Everyone
part of
is a selfish
Catalonia.
kid.
Rome was
no
part
one
of Catalonia.
connects with the
Right?
larger,
They controlled
with
the
their
Mediterranean.
weaker neighbours. I
So
don't
they had
agree.
a belief,
I don't
going
agree.
back centuries. Why did it revive, is the question.
Same in Italy.
That
Northern
has
Italy.
the economic
Well, it's very
roots.
different to 1929.
In any case,
because in
you should know
1929
this.
you had economic strife.
You should know
You're
this.
telling me
There's
now
no economic
that the
strife.
reason why Catalonia wants independence is because it's doing better.
It's
not
because
it's doing
better
worse.
than the rest of Spain, whose economy
Ah.
suffered
So
a
it's about
massive
differential.
collapse.
So we're all
a
driven by
massive
jealousy
collapse.
and greed.
I
You
didn't
seem
say
to be
all driven, but
Well,
you're saying it's
I don't
driven
know.
by philosophy. I'm pointing out the material foundation for these philosophies. That's
Which is
why.
materialism.
That is why,
Money.
after all,
I want more money
that
than
is
my
why,
next door
after all,
neighbours.
in
You
30
seem to be a
years,
capitalist.
in 30 years of heckling me at Speaker's Corner, you should know that as a Marxist, the material is the foundation.
I know.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm finishing for the day.
And you are a capitalist.
Thank you very much.
Very good, very good, very passionate. Very good, very good, very good. Also, yeah, it's very good. Very good. But this young
Joy,
man,
which
he
way are
tried
you
to
voting on
understand
Thursday?
everything he said. He quite complicated.
Of course, I don't know.
And he
I'm
asked
a
me
member
to
of the Labour
translate
Party,
for him.
but I won't be voting.
Very difficult. I said he grew up, you know. This is the
I'm
future.
lending my vote to the Lib Dems.
This is the future of China. This young boy from China. He tried to understand.
怎么样？
He tried to understand what you
从
said.
哪里来呀？
从哪里来？你看
什么地方？北京啊，北京好玩。
Content over everything. From your
Come, man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. Listen. COE. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
Let me speak. Ali. I can speak. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. I don't even listen to Sky, man. Man, don't listen to COE. Man, just listen to.
You can say whatever you want. I can prove that. Smack me on around my face. I can prove it.
COE. Man, not even know BBC. Man, not even know ITV.
His word
Not even
against my
listen to
word.
MUM. They just listen to COE.